Good afternoon. My name is Shawn Ulmer. I'm Executive Director here at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. I want to thank you all for coming to join us for another Zoom presentation on our current temporary exhibition, Carl Van Vechten, Man About Town. Hopefully you had a chance to see the presentation we did in March, which was part of our Art Bite series, which kind of gave an overview of the exhibition. I hope that you will join us in early May for a two-part Sunday presentation of the artists that Carl Van Vechten photographed that are on view in the exhibition, and the works that they created and how they were important to the evolution of early 20th century art. So that's coming up in May, and it's on two consecutive Sundays, the first two Sundays in May. And our curator, Kate Kunow, will be doing that presentation. So hopefully you can join us then. Today, we're going to be looking at Carl Van Vechten's images of dancers and how they compare to dancers from another artist in our collection who's not on view currently, and that's Arnold Genthe. Very interesting comparison between the two photographers. But at this point, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get my PowerPoint up for you. Wait till this allows me to start. Just a second. Just a second. There we go. There we are. Wonderful. So before we begin, I do want to thank our funders who enabled the exhibition and the educational programming to happen. This exhibition, the Carl Van Vechten Man About Town exhibition, and the accompanying educational programming have been made possible by the McIntyre Foundation and by the CRST International Donor Advised Fund and the Diamond V Corporate Fund of the Greater Cedar Rapids Community Foundation. Additional support has been provided by the Iowa Arts Council, which is a division of the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs and the National Endowment for the Arts. The program support grant from the Greater Cedar Rapids Community Foundation, members of the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, and contributors to the museum's annual fund. Annual educational programming has been supported in part by Transamerica. My thanks to all of these supporters for making the exhibition and the educational programming possible. So thank you. I won't go into great detail on Carl Van Vechten's biography. I do that much more extensively in the March presentation that you can find on our YouTube channel, the museum's YouTube channel. But I will highlight for you some of the things in Carl Van Vechten's biography that really sort of pertain to his interest in dance. Here's an image of our friend, Carl Van Vechten. He was born in 1880 and died in 1964. He was born here in Cedar Rapids. He was the youngest child of Charles Duane Van Vechten and Ada Van Vechten. His father was a wealthy and prominent banker here in town. His mother was a great musical talent and was most notable for having established the Cedar Rapids Public Library. As a child, Carl Van Vechten developed a passion for music and for theater. In 1898, he graduates from Washington High School here in Cedar Rapids, and then goes to the University of Chicago, where he studied a variety of topics, including music, art, and opera. He became increasingly interested in writing and wrote for the college newspaper. In 1903, he graduates from the University of Chicago and lands a job as a columnist for the Chicago American, where he authored a somewhat gossip and criticism column, as well as covering some of the crime beat. In 1906, he moves to New York City, where he is hired as the assistant music critic for the New York Times. In 1907, because of his interest in opera, he takes a leave of absence from the Times and travels to Europe to explore more about opera firsthand. In 1909, he returns to the New York Times, where he becomes the first American critic of modern dance. He became engrossed in the avant-garde dance movement. Groundbreaking dancers such as Isadora Duncan, Anna Pavlova, and Loie Fuller, who were performing both in Europe and in New York City, was really what inspired him to pursue dance as an interest and to land this job as the first New York Times critic of dance. He writes for the New York Times for many years, eventually leaves the New York Times and publishes a series of essays in the later teens, from about 1915 to about 1920. You will find collected essays in book form, many of which deal with dance. In the 20s, he turns instead to writing novels, and he wrote a series of novels throughout the 20s. And it is not until the 1930s that at the age of 50, that he picks up the camera, the 35 millimeter Leica, and he starts shooting some of the famous people that he has encountered in his lifetime, and uses his apartment at 150 West 55th Street in New York as his studio. And that's sort of the background of how he became interested both in dance and in photography. So all of the photographs that we're going to be looking at today are dated from that time, from the 1930s forward. And we're going to look at Carl Van Vechten first, and then take a look at Arnold Genthe, who precedes him by a generation, kind of take a look at the differences and the similarities between these two artists. So up first, I want to show two works that are in the exhibition. One is Ram Gopal from 1938. The other is Bill Bojangles Robinson. Ram Gopal was an Indian dancer and choreographer who performed mostly as a soloist, touring throughout the United States and Europe during his lengthy career. He blended classical Indian dance with ballet and was notable for that. Bill Bojangles Robinson began dancing for a living at the age of 6. He was a success as a nightclub and musical comedy performer in vaudeville, and had a very long career. He appeared in several movies, several films with Shirley Temple. And although vaudeville's popularity waned, Bill Robinson's popularity never did. And he was a success throughout his career. Here you see with Ram Gopal, him in his attire as an Indian dancer. With Bill Bojangles Robinson, you see him sort of performing. You see him actually doing some dance steps as captured. Both of these images are a little bit unusual for Carl Van Vechten. The Ram Gopal is a little bit more traditional, where you see the sitter really waist length and against a background of Carl Van Vechten's choosing, very close to the picture plane. What's unusual about Bill Bojangles Robinson's depiction is that you actually see him performing, and there's much more space between the viewer and the individual. And that is something that I think Carl Van Vechten, because of his interest in dance, was very, very sensitive to. He portrayed dancers differently than he portrayed most of his other sitters. Here's a couple more representations from the exhibition. I think the Cab Calloway that we have is actually slightly different than this one. When Carl would have somebody over to do a shoot, he would oftentimes shoot many, many, many shots in that sitting, and they would all be slightly different from each other. And he didn't choose just one, then that would become the one, and then he would leave the rest to not be developed. He would actually shoot and enlarge many different versions. And so the one that you see in our exhibition is very similar to the one that you see on the screen here, but ours is slightly different. And you will find that, that there will be lots of unique prints by Carl Van Vechten that are very similar to other prints, but all are actually unique. Cab Calloway here from 33, and Pro Primus from 43. Now you might see also the notation here, CRCSD. That means this is actually in the collection of the Cedar Rapids Community School District. All of the photographs of Carl Van Vechten that I'll be showing you, I should say all of them, but most of them that I'll be showing you today come from the school district's collection. The school district was given 153 photographs in 1946 by Carl Van Vechten, from Carl Van Vechten. These were augmented in 1996, 50 years later, by another 29 photographs. So 182 photographs by Carl Van Vechten donated to the Cedar Rapids Community School District that are permanently housed here at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. And they form the basis of this exhibition. So that's what that abbreviation means. And these are both examples of it. The one by Cab Calloway is a very nice depiction. The one of Pearl Primus, on the other hand, you see slightly at an angle. These were shots that we were taking as the works were coming into the museum. They came into the museum's possession shortly after the floods of 2008, when the works were still framed up. We were taking incoming photographs of them, and we shot them at a slight angle because of the glare from the frame. So please, my apologies, accept my apologies for the slight skewed angle here. Cab Calloway was an American jazz singer, songwriter, dancer, band leader, conductor, and actor who was associated particularly with the Cotton Club in Harlem, where he was a regular performer and became a popular vocalist in the swing era. He had a niche for mixing jazz and vaudeville, and his career lasted some 65 years. Pearl Primus dancing the blues. She was an American dancer, choreographer, and anthropologist who played an important role in the presentation of African dance to American audiences. Her work was a reaction to the myths of savagery and the lack of knowledge about African people. Her effort was to guide the Western world to view African dance as an important and dignified statement about another way of life. Here again, with these two depictions of dancers, we see them actually dancing, which is very different. Carl Van Vechten's photographs of artists did not depict them painting. Carl Van Vechten's photographs of actors did not depict them acting. Carl Van Vechten's depictions of writers did not depict them writing. But with dancers, he very much took a different tack. He wanted to show them in movement, which was unusual for Carl Van Vechten and very difficult really to capture properly with film. Avon Long, the one image on the left is the one in the exhibition. The one on the right is not. It's another Carl Van Vechten representation of Avon Long, shot on the same day. So here's two very different depictions of Avon Long, both sort of in character as Sport and Life from Porgy and Bess. One sort of in front of this sort of louvered window, and one actually dancing. Avon Long was an American Broadway actor and singer who performed in a number of Broadway shows, including Porgy and Bess, which is what he was most famous for originally, and then again in the revival as well. And then for the 1951 Columbia recording as well. And here you see him sort of more of a solo shot on the left, but in costume, in character, and then performing on the right. Here, depictions both from 1940, both from the school district collection, but not on view in the current exhibition. This is Catherine Dunham and La Argentinita. Catherine Dunham was an American dancer, choreographer, and creator of the Dunham technique. She was also an author, educator, anthropologist, and social activist. She had one of the most successful dance careers in African American and European theater of the 20th century. She owned her own dance company, and she had been called the matriarch and queen mother of Black dance. At the height of her career, which was the 40s and 50s, she was renowned throughout Europe and Latin America and widely popular in the United States. The Washington Post called her dancer Catherine the Great. La Argentinita was a Spanish Argentine flamenco dancer, choreographer, and singer. She was considered the highest expression of this art form during this time. Both sort of dressed in character, as you see here, both sort of the more traditional up close cropped image of the feature against a background, creating a fairly compressed space, but both with kind of gestures that imply movement. Here, Annabel Lyon and Agnes Demille, both as characters in Three Virgins and the Devil. Annabel Lyon was an American ballerina. She was a principal dancer for the American Ballet Theater. Her repertoire included classical as well as contemporary works by the company's founders, Anthony Tudor and Agnes Demille. And she was involved, as you can see here, in Demille's 1941 Three Virgins and a Devil, portrayed as the lustful one. Agnes Demille was an American dancer and choreographer. Awards included Tony Award for Best Choreographer in 1947 for Brigadoon. And she was also most notably, I should say more recently, featured on the U.S. postage stamp in 2004. Here, two very different versions of characters from the same performance. One kind of up close in character, adopting a pose. The other one sort of full length, again, adopting a pose as well, but more sort of in dance form. George Zorrich and Donald Sadler. George Zorrich was a Russian-born American ballet dancer who starred in performances by the Ballet Russe companies on stages all over the United States from the 30s to the 60s. Internationally renowned as one of the more glamorous figures and striking personalities in mid-20th century ballet. Donald Edward Sadler was an American choreographer, dancer, and theater director. Won the Tony Award for Best Choreographer in 1953 for Wonderful Town. Also won the Tony Award for Best Choreographer in 1971 for No No Nanette, and won the Drama Desk Award for that same performance in 1971. Both seen dressed in character, one kind of a full-length pose, the other one a cropped version as a sort of cowboy dancer. Again, sort of both of these scenes at a slightly askew angle because of the incoming photographs, both in the collection of the school district, but not on view in this current exhibition. And then Nora Kay, here, an American prima ballerina known for her ability to perform classical roles, called the Deuce Dance, and after the acclaimed actress Eleanor Deuce. She was also worked in films and performed on Broadway. Here, kind of a typical cropped photograph, which is really showing the torso and again, sort of adopting a pose. Anton Dolan and Alicia Markova, both again works from the school district. Sir Anton Dolan was an English ballet dancer and choreographer. He joined the ballet theater when it was formed in 1940 and remained there as dancer and choreographer until 1946. Dame Alicia Markova was also a British ballerina and a choreographer, director, and teacher of classical ballet. She's most noted for her career with Diaghilev's Ballet Russe and touring internationally. She was considered one of the greatest classical ballet dancers of the 20th century. She became the first British dancer to become a principal dancer of a ballet company with Margot Fonteyn, is one of only two English dancers to be recognized as a prima ballerina assoluta. Markova was the founder dancer of the Rambert Dance Company, the Royal Ballet, and the American Ballet Theater, and was co-founder and director of the English National Ballet. Both sort of full-length representations on the same floor in Carl Van Vechten's studio. And Jose Fernandez from 1939, also a piece in the school district. He was also he was a Spanish American dancer known for doing his Spanish work. And here, Vicente Escuero from 1933 was a Spanish flamenco dancer closely associated with the avant-garde. And here is a fairly typical kind of representation by Carl Van Vechten of a figure, in this case, not in costume, not striking a pose, but more of a straight up portrait photography. Again, very compressed space against a backdrop. This is a fairly typical kind of arrangement for Carl Van Vechten, one that he would use frequently with actors, with artists, with writers, and so forth. Here used with a dancer, but not one that was in costume. And tangentially related, and I include these representations because they actually do appear in a book on Carl Van Vechten and the dance. There was a book published with selections, and here Aaron Copland and George M. Cohan, who were both known for creating works that around the dance. Copland was an American composer and composition teacher and writer, later a conductor of his own and other American music. He was instrumental in forging a distinctive American style of composition, oftentimes referred to as the Dean of American Composers. He's known for Appalachian Spring, Billy the Kid, and Rodeo, Fanfare for the Common Man, Third Symphony, and these frequently involved dancers. George M. Cohan was an American entertainer, playwright, composer, lyricist, actor, singer, dancer in his own right, and producer. Published over 300 songs during his lifetime, including Over There, Give My Regards to Broadway, Yankee Doodle Boy, You're a Grand Old Flag, all of which involved dance. He was known in the decade before World War I as the man who owned Broadway, and is considered the father of American musical comedy. And so these sort of have been included in sort of Carl Van Vechten's corpus of dance imagery. These are fairly typical presentations of more portrait photography of a sitter, somewhat, truncated in a very shallow space against a background. And Lincoln Kirsten from later, much later in Carl Van Vechten's career from 1964. He was an American writer, impresario, art connoisseur, philanthropist, and cultural figure in New York City, noted especially as the co-founder of the New York City Ballet, serving as the company's general director from 1946 to 1989. So here's somebody associated with the dance, but not a dancer himself. Now we're going to look at a couple figures who are sort of related to each other, if you will. Anthony Tudor was an English ballet choreographer, teacher, and dancer who, with George Balanchine, was seen as the principal transformer of ballet into modern dance. Baryshnikov said, "We do Tudor's ballets because we must. Tudor's work is our conscience." Here, a portrait of Anthony Tudor and his longtime partner, Hugh Lang. Hugh Lang was one of the most significant dramatic ballet dancers of the 20th century. He was both partner and choreographer of Anthony Tudor. He was known for his good looks and the intensity of his stage presence. He was never considered a great technician, but his powers of characterization and his sense of theatrical timing were considered remarkable. He's considered one of the greatest dramatic dancers of the 20th century and remained Tudor's artistic collaborator and companion until the choreographer's death in 1987. And Carl Van Vechten did many, many photographs of Hugh Lang. Here, two more from the Cedar Rapids Community School District collection in different character from the same year, but different characters. And then here from around the same time, the early 1940s, 2 more representations. And then Hugh Lang was one of 2 where Carl Van Vechten did a series of photographs. These are not from the school district collection, but ones I found in my research that come from a completely different setting. These are not images that are frequently represented when one looks at Carl Van Vechten's work, but they show a very interesting side of him. He's using a dancer, Hugh Lang, here with another dancer, Alan Meadows. And he's really exploring the contrast between black and white in literal terms and in photographic terms, really. So he did a whole series of photographs of these 2 individuals in different poses, sort of contrasted against each other. It's a very interesting turn or twist, very different kind of twist for Carl Van Vechten and for his representations of the dance. And he also did these interesting solo shots of them. Here, Hugh Lang, who's posing sort of as Saint Sebastian, where you can sort of see these arrows superimposed through him, and then Alan Meadows standing sort of against one of Carl Van Vechten's backdrops. He was really fascinated in this contrast, and it's one of the things that sort of looking at dance and dancers sort of opens up, is our ability to kind of take a closer look at where Carl Van Vechten takes us. He does not do this with other genres. He does not do this with writers or artists or actors. But the dancers is a medium that really, really speaks to Van Vechten. And so it allowed him to really explore the dancer's body, the dancer's physique, allowed him to really sort of do something different in his photography. These were not ones that were sort of generally released for public consumption, but ones that betray a different kind of interest on Carl Van Vechten's part in exploring the dancer and the dancer's body. And a few other names that might be more familiar to you: Alvin Ailey, from 1955, so a very early shot here. Alvin Ailey was an African-American choreographer and activist who founded the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater in New York City. He is really credited with popularizing modern dance and revolutionizing African-American participation in 20th century concert dance. He made use of a wide variety of combinations of dance techniques that best suited his interests, and he approached his dancers more in the manner of a jazz conductor, requiring them to infuse his choreography, with a personal style that best suited their individual talents. So he really wanted the dancer to contribute to his choreography, working upon their strengths that they could contribute, kind of like improv in jazz, where they all contributed to the final production. Or here, Paul Taylor, another name that still has great resonance today. Paul Taylor was an American modern dancer and choreographer known for the inventive, frequently humorous dances that he choreographed for his company. He began his professional career in 1953 with Martha Graham's company and danced a solo created for him by George Balanchine in 1959. So right before these photographs, that Balanchine and Graham worked together to create a piece specifically for Paul Taylor, and his company is still performing today. Or here are a couple of images of Martha Graham. She was an American modern dancer and choreographer. Her style, the Graham technique, reshaped American dance and is still taught today worldwide. She danced and taught for over 70 years. She was the first dancer to perform at the White House, travel abroad as a cultural ambassador, and to receive the highest civilian award in the United States, the Presidential Medal of Freedom with distinction. She founded her company in 1926, and it is the oldest school dance in the United States. So that is sort of an overview of Carl Van Vechten's imagery of dancers, some of which are in the current exhibition, and others which sort of drawn in, to kind of really fill out a more complete view of what Carl Van Vechten was doing. Now I want to kind of go back a little bit in time and look at sort of one of the premier dance photographers prior to Carl Van Vechten. Keep in mind that Carl Van Vechten began photographing in 1930. So the photographs we've been looking at have largely been between 1930 and his death in 1964. So, so really kind of a 30-year span. But there were other photographers of dance prior to that. And one that I thought might be interesting to take a look at was Arnold Genthe, who is an artist that we have a few works by in our collection, although he was an extremely prolific photographer. Some 30,000 photographs are known to be by Genthe out there. And not all of them were about dance, because that is not actually what Genthe's claim to fame is. And we'll get to that in a second. So Arnold Genthe here, two self-portraits, one as a young man and one much more mature in his career, was a German-American photographer who was actually best known for his photographs of San Francisco's Chinatown and the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, which he witnessed firsthand. And of course, portrait photography of notable people, from politicians to socialites to literary figures and entertainment celebrities. So in that way, very similar to Carl Van Vechten. He was born in Berlin, and his father was a professor of Latin and Greek. And he actually followed his father's footsteps, became a classically trained scholar. He emigrated to San Francisco in 1895 to work as a tutor for the son of Baron and Baroness J. Henrik von Schroeder. And it was in San Francisco that he taught himself photography. So in that way, he's very similar to Carl Van Vechten. They both taught themselves photography. Genthe was particularly intrigued by the Chinese section of the city and photographed its inhabitants, from children to drug addicts. Due to the subject's possible fear of the camera, and there was a fear of the camera, or the reluctance to have their pictures taken, many of these were immigrants, Genthe sometimes had to hide his camera when he took these shots. He also sometimes reworked his photographs to remove evidence of Western culture, because Chinatown in San Francisco was oftentimes a blend of East and West, from these pictures by cropping or erasing elements as needed. About 200 of his Chinatown pictures survive. These comprise the only known photographic depiction of Chinatown before the 1906 earthquake. And so I'm going to share with you a few of these photographs I found in my research, where you can see Genthe's interest in Chinatown was really capturing the people, oftentimes in authentic cultural dress, as they sort of went about everyday activities in Chinatown. Here, a hybrid image, if you will. In 1906, the San Francisco earthquake and fire destroyed his studio, but he rebuilt. His photographs of the earthquake's aftermath, especially this one looking down Sacramento Street in San Francisco on April 18, 1906, is his most famous photograph. And here you see one view of it. And here you see another view of the same photograph, but this time cropped. And he was there with his camera capturing this imagery and the aftermath of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, which not only did damage to the buildings, but started fires which really wiped out the city totally. By the spring of 1907, he's re-established his residence in his studio in San Francisco. In 1911, he moves to New York City, where he remained until his death of a heart attack in 1942. So he's, ending his career at the time that Carl Van Vechten is beginning his. He worked primarily in portraiture in New York, and Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, John D. Rockefeller all sat for him. His photos of Greta Garbo were credited with boosting her career. He also photographed dancers, which is the topic of our talk today, including Anna Pavlova, Isadora Duncan, Audrey Munson, Helen Muller, and Ruth St. Denis. And his photographs were featured in a 1916 book called The Book of the Dance. We're going to start with this image of Isadora Duncan from our collection. And Isadora Duncan is probably a name that is familiar to most of you. She was an incredible force on the dance in the dance world. She was born in 1878 and died in 1927. So she passed away before Carl Van Vechten started to photograph, but he saw Isadora Duncan dance. So he knew her well, but unfortunately was not photographing at the time that she was alive. She was an American dancer who performed to great acclaim throughout Europe and the US. She was born and raised in California, but lived and danced most of her life in Western Europe, and also danced and performed in the United States and the Soviet Union from the age of 22 until her death in 1950, when her scarf became entangled in the wheel and axle of the car in which she was traveling in Nice, France. It pulled her from the car, breaking her neck instantly, killing her on the spot. Duncan's novel approach to dance had been evident since the classes that she had been taught, since she had taken, but she began teaching as a dancer herself as a teenager, where she, quote, followed her fantasy and improvised, teaching anything that came into her head. She was not a classically trained dancer, but she really was very intuitive in her dance technique. A desire of travel brought her to Chicago from California, where she had auditioned for many theatrical companies, finally finding a place in Augustin Daly's company. This took her to New York City, where her unique vision of dance clashed with the popular pantomimes of theater companies. While in New York, she took a few classes, but was quickly disappointed with ballet. She felt unhappy and unappreciated in the United States, and she went to London in 1898. And she began to perform in drawing rooms of the wealthy, taking inspiration from Greek vases and bas-reliefs in the British Museum. So she goes to the British Museum and she sees poses on terracotta pottery, on shallow reliefs from Greek and Roman periods, and she incorporates those and makes those into dances. And this was very new, very novel. Nobody was doing anything like that. And you can see her sort of really kind of adopting that. You see here in a sort of like an elongated toga, a long diaphanous outfit, here adopting a pose that one might find on the side of a Greek piece of pottery or in a relief. And that really, it forms the foundation of her dance technique. From London, she travels to Paris, where she is inspired by things she sees at the Louvre and at the Exposition Universelle of 1900. And in France, as elsewhere, she delights her audiences. In 1902, the dancer Loie Fuller invites her to tour with her. This took Duncan all over Europe, and she creates new works using her innovative technique, which emphasized natural movements in contrast to the rigidity of traditional ballet. She spent most of the rest of her life touring Europe and the Americas in this fashion. So I show you here a photograph from our collection of Isadora Duncan in La Marseillaise from around 1917. Here, another Genthe photograph where he just takes a portion of that same photograph and creates it as a roundel. Here, another sort of very kind of classical, and I mean by that classical art inspired pose of Isadora Duncan from around the same year. And here, in a somewhat damaged photograph that we have, we see her adopting another pose in this kind of Greek chiton dress. So again, very, very different from what you would find in classical ballet. Here, again, there's very, very sort of famous pose. Here, I'm sorry, I show you the studio photograph. This is a different photograph. This is taken from a collection in the Library of Congress. And it's a little bit harsher than I think Genthe would have developed it. I'm going to go back one. This is the kind of photograph that Genthe would have released. But this is actually the studio shot in the same studio setting. So here you can see the curtain more vividly. That's all sort of manipulated and sort of then softened so that the focus is really on the dancer themselves, or in this case, herself. Here is Isadora Duncan from 1909. Again, a very dramatic kind of pose against a curtain. Again, like Carl Van Vechten, showing the full figure, showing the figure in costume, but here with a lot more space. This is a great sort of stillness. This is almost like a relief, almost like something you would see on the side of a Greek vase. I'm going to diverge here for a second to show you some different works from our collection. These are 3 works by Abraham Walkowicz. I'm sharing these with you right now to underscore the fact that Walkowicz was one of many, many, many artists who were inspired by Isadora Duncan. Isadora Duncan was a phenomenon. What she was doing to dance in the early 20th century was remarkable. And so many visual artists, photographers, and traditional fine arts artists were inspired by her. Abraham Walkowicz was one of those artists. He was introduced to Isadora Duncan in the studio of sculptor Auguste Rodin during a trip to France in 1906. And he was influenced by her nature-inspired dance when he saw her perform in a private salon. He sketched her continuously from about 1906 on, and it is estimated that he created over 5,000 sketches of Isadora Duncan throughout his lifetime. These are somewhat deceptively simple line drawings that convey her muscular strength, unusual suppleness, and infinite subtle variety of her movements. Walkowitz's drawings are considered the most comprehensive record that captures her movements. Seen together, they really sort of show the full range of her choreographer. The museum owns 148 drawings of Isadora Duncan by Abraham Walkowicz. And this is just a small portion of the sum of the 5,000 sum that he created during his lifetime. So I just wanted to depart just briefly to sort of underscore the fact that Isadora Duncan was a force of nature in the dance world. Here, Anna Duncan dancing is another Genthe photograph. Now, Isadora Duncan had 3 children, all of whom died when they were young, 2 tragically in an accident with their nanny when their car plunged into the Seine. And so all 3 of her children passed away, but Isadora Duncan had a number of pupils, and she adopted 6 of them. And so she establishes her first dance studio in Berlin in 1904. And this is where she was really the birthplace of what she called the Isadorables. And this was Anna, Maria Theresa, Irma, Liesel, Gretel, and Erica, who were all Duncan's proteges who would continue her legacy. She legally adopts all 6 girls in 1919, and they take her last name. And after establishing her school in Berlin, she then establishes her school in Paris. That was closed shortly after that because of the outbreak of World War I. In 1914, she moves her school to the United States in New York. And so the Isadorables come with her. And so here's one of them, Anna Duncan, dancing here on the beach in Long Island, photographed by Genthe. Here is an Isadora Duncan dancer who might be Irma Duncan. Seen this sort of, I've seen this photograph identified as Isadora Duncan dancer and as Irma Duncan. So its exact identity is not quite yet known, but again the photograph. Here is Isadora Duncan dancer, seen in the out of doors. This, and again, the sort of dancer in the out of doors is very similar to the Carl Van Vechten's Hugh Lang out of doors, but here in this sort of diaphanous Greek attire. Isadora Duncan and students, again, kind of the Isadorables. Here, another photograph, basically the same photograph, but in a rectangular versus a round format. And here's the Isadorables at the Untermeyer estate in Yonkers from around 1911. And this has been identified as Anna, Irma, Mary Teresa, and 2 other dancers. So these are at least three of the 6 Isadorables. And then Elizabeth Duncan dancer. Now, Elizabeth Duncan was the sister of Isadora Duncan, and she created her own dance company, a slightly damaged photograph, but this shows some of her dancers in sort of the out of doors, this wonderful kind of pseudo-Greek archway, really more Roman than Greek, sort of in the out of doors. Here, another shot from that same shoot with more dancers. Here, another view of the Elizabeth Duncan dancers, probably from the same shoot from around 1916. And here, the Elizabeth Duncan dancers. This one's identified as children, although I've yet to find the children, but that is how it is identified in the Library of Congress. And so here 2 dancers kind of going, again, in this very classically inspired locale. And I showed you the actual Library of Congress version of this photograph. And where you see that in our photograph, Genthe has cropped it and has removed a bit of the foreground. And a bit of the archway up above to really make it a much more compressed space. But overall, in this feeling with these dancers in the outer doors, both with Isadora Duncan and Elizabeth Duncan and the Isadorables, the out of door images feel very different than Carl Van Vechten's studio shots. These are, dancers. I mean, a lot of Isadora Duncan, is inspired by Greek and Roman precedents, but also really inspired by nature. Ballet was seen to be not natural, to be formal, to be stiff, to be rigid at this time. And so this communing with nature, dancing and frolicking in nature was part and parcel of what Isadora Duncan was introducing to the dance world. And so Genthe is taking those photographs out in nature. Very different concept than what Carl Van Vechten was doing. Here's Margaret Severn. Margaret Severn was an internationally acclaimed dancer who was most famous for using more than a dozen different Benda masks in the Greenwich Village Follies of 1921. She's known particularly for using masks in her dance, but she was trained as a classical ballet artist, and you can see her in that pose here. At the age of 9, she moves to London, where she makes her solo debut at the Hotel Savoy in 1914, so before this image. Then she moves to New York, and she continues and takes classes at the Shawn School. We'll talk about that in a moment. At the age of 15, she appears at the Metropolitan Opera in Aida. She was a soloist for Ruth St. Denis. She appears on Broadway's and, as I mentioned before, the Greenwich Village Follies. So here she is seen in ballet. And here, in her Korean warrior dance, 2 different views, both from our collection, in this wonderful kind of Greek inspired gown. Here, a view from the Library of Congress that shows the actual sort of studio setting of Margaret Severn. Here she is in another costume dance. Again, these are set in a studio versus in the outer doors, as we saw with the Duncan photographs. And here you can see the trace of the studio to the left-hand side. Here clearer when compared to the Library of Congress version of the photograph. And here an unidentified dancer who is thought to be Margaret Severn on the beach, similar to what he did with some of the Duncan dancers, photographing them on the beach, probably Long Island. And here you see in the Library of Congress photograph, you can actually see the shadow of Genthe's camera that he crops out and then he sort of masks out in the final version. There's another unidentified dancer on the beach, probably Margaret Severn. And here a scarf dance, Margaret Severn. Wonderful reflections. Very different sort of out of door presentation of a dancer, letting the wind kind of take that diaphanous costume. And here compared to another version of the same photograph, you can see in photographs like this how Genthe was able to modify and change things. In the image on the left, which is the one from our collection, you can see that he has lightened her hair. He has lightened Margaret Severn's hair from dark, as you see on the right, to a lighter, blonder version of Margaret Severn. Here, another photograph of Severn from our collection, again on the beach, probably the same shot, same shoot, 1923. And here another version of it where you can see he is also he's not only cropped our version, but he's also modified on the right the hair there as well. Helen Muller, about whom I know nothing, is another image from our collection. Need to do more research on her. Her name does appear in, but not much in the way of biography on her at all. And then Ruth St. Denis. We have a number of photographs of Ruth St. Denis in our collection. She was an American pioneer of modern dance. She introduced Asian ideas into the art. She was co-founder of the American Shawn School of Dancing and Related Arts and the teacher of several notable performers. She's a very long biography, and I won't tell you all of it. You can certainly look her up. But she begins her solo career in 1905, and it was about that time that she made her first European tour and used the stage name of St. Denis. Choreography was not culturally accurate or authentic. It was expressive of the themes that she perceived in Oriental culture, highly entertaining and to contemporary audiences. She believed dance to be spiritual expression and choreography to reflect this. So, in 1911, a young dancer named Ted Shawn saw St. Denis perform in Denver, and it was Artistic Love at First Sight in 1914. He applied to be her student, soon her artistic partner and husband. And together they opened the Denis Shawn School, so they kind of merged their names, which was based in Los Angeles, and they opened that in 1915 and taught countless individuals. So here, a more formal portrait photograph of her. Here, her as White Jade. Two different photographs from sort of the same shoot. Again, you can kind of see where she is infusing Asian culture. Again, not culturally accurate, really sort of her vision of it. First, she was first inspired by Egyptian, and there was a lot of Egyptomania happening at the time with the discovery of a variety of Egyptian tombs. And then she went further, if you will, sort of further exotic, and was incorporating Asian motifs into her dance and her performances. Here's Ted Shawn, who was her student, then collaborator, then husband and partner, forming the Denis Shawn School. And here I wanted to compare it to the Library of Congress version of this photograph, where you can see more of the studio that Genthe then crops out to create his final work. It's kind of nice that we have all of these photographs at the Library of Congress. If you want to explore more of Genthe's photography, the Library of Congress has an extensive collection. I believe they have upwards of 23,000 photographs by Arnold Genthe, of which 3,000 or so are photographs of dancers. Including these prints of sort of studio photographs. I didn't give you much in the way of biography of Ted Shawn, but you can find a lot of that if you were to research it. But he and we say Denis, formed the Denis Shawn School, of whence Florence Denis Shawn was a student. So here's a photograph of one of their students. She was an American actress and model, one of the first groups of dancers associated with the Denis Shawn School. She studied with Ted Shawn and Ruth St. Denis in California. When she became a professional dancer, she wanted to be billed as Florence of Denis Shawn, but the name became Florence Denis Shawn in a printing error, and she continued to work under that name then afterwards. She was a member of the Ziegfeld Follies. She was in 2 silent films, and the latter of which, Monsieur Beaucaire, she danced with Rudolph Valentino. Here you can see her in character from 1921. I also include the image from the Library of Congress. Here, same costume, closer, a little more coquette-y. You can see the Library of Congress print is clearer, but it's also a bit harsher. One of the things that, keep in mind that Genthe was photographing largely through the pictorial period of photography, which had a little bit softer quality to it. It was an attempt on the part of many photographers to raise photography to an art form. And so it tends to have a slightly different and softer focus. It was, wasn't trying to be just a documentary kind of photograph. They wanted it to have artistic, fine art, artistic elements, one of which oftentimes included a softening of the focus, a real interest in sepia tones. And so while the Library of Congress photograph is probably very accurate to the negative, the image that we have in our collection, which is on the left, is probably very accurate to the way that Arnold Genthe wanted the final image to look. He didn't want it to be a documentary photograph. He was very interested in sort of the fine arts qualities of photography. Here, Hilda Bayer, who was the original dance partner of Ted Shawn before joining Denis Shawn. and again, a photograph of her, of the actual photograph in the studio. You can see the way in which Genthe has softened the outlines and have really created a mood with the background, the toning of the background. Here, Hilde Bayer again in a different shoot, all about light and shadow, very artistic in the out of doors. And you can see how he has really transformed what would be a straight printing of the negative into a much more artistic one. Look how he has manipulated the light in the background coming through the trees. You know, it really becomes all focused on the dancer and the light. How the light is striking the dancer and her costume. Florence Faulkner, another artist that I have no biography on, but was sort of another very classically, Greek-inspired costume performance. It looks very much like a figure you would see on a Greek vase or from a Greek relief. And here, a somewhat elusive photograph that's been identified by his 3 different possible dancers, but it's a wonderful representation of Genthe's, trying to capture a dancer in movement, in actual movement, not in a sort of stilted or stopped posed image, but one that's sort of moving in this kind of a hula grass skirt dance that you see here. Again, we have much more work to do in identifying specifically who this is, but sort of a nice representation of a figure and an actual movement. This is Lindahl, another dancer that needs more research. And here, compared to the actual studio photographs, you can see how he has worked with that original negative to create something that's much softer, much more artistic. And the Marion Morgan dancers, another group of dancers in the museum's collection. She was an American choreographer and motion picture screenwriter and longtime companion of motion picture director Dorothy Arzner. She married Matthew Morgan in 1900, and they had a son the next year, but separated by 1905. In 1910, she and her son had relocated to Long Beach, California, where she was employed as a physical education teacher. Later, she was hired as a dance instructor at the University of California, Berkeley. She began recruiting girls for a dance troupe to perform in vaudeville on the Orpheum circuit. In the 1915, she also staged a publicity dance in the snow in Central Park in Manhattan. Originally, she had 6 women who were a part of her group. It did grow eventually to 25, and occasionally would employ a male dancer. It was primarily, however, a female troupe. They performed interpretive dance, bare-armed and sometimes barefooted, as you see here, in filmy costumes with a repertoire based on Egyptian and classical Greek and Roman themes. So you can see, at this time, in addition to what Isadora, what Duncan was doing, and Elizabeth, what Duncan was doing, and Margaret Severn was doing, many other artists like Marion Morgan, were also very inspired by kind of the precedent of Isadora Duncan, and there just really was this widespread interest in this kind of classical Greek forms, very interpretive, looks like it comes right off of Greek ceramics or Greek friezes. And here the museum photograph against the Library of Congress print. You can see how the composition was cropped by Genthe. And then I'm going to end with an image that's not in the museum's collection. This is Anna Pavlova, who was another very, very important dancer. She was a Russian prima ballerina of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. She was a principal of the Imperial Russian Ballet and the Ballet Russe under Diaghilev. Pavlova was most recognized for her creation of the role of the dying swan, and with her own company became the first ballerina to tour around the world, including performances in South America, India, and Australia. She was an inspiration to countless other dancers. And while this is not an image from our own collection, I wanted to bring it in because I didn't want to talk about dance in the early part of the 20th century without including Anna Pavlova. Plus, she also was the inspiration, like Isadora Duncan, for countless other visual artists. And I want to share with you a couple pieces from our collection by Malvina Hoffman. This is the Bacchanal Freeze that you can find wrapping its way around the Carnegie wing of the museum. This was a frieze created by Malvina Hoffman. She first saw the famous dancer Pavlova perform ballet in London in 1910. She was overwhelmed and returned time and time again to watch the performance, to memorize it, and to record each movement. She wanted to portray the energy of Pavlova's dance in sculpture. Her teacher, Malvina's teacher, was Rodin, and she, really, with his help, attempted to reproduce the vitality of the dance in several sculptures. She studied anatomy at the Cornell College of Physicians and Surgeons in New York City to help understand the physical poses of dancers. As her studies of dance progressed, she was finally able to meet Pavlova in 1914. They had a great relationship. They grew to be close personal friends. Hoffman began the first drawings for the frieze in 1914, and then proposed the idea of capturing the Bacchanal to Pavlova, who consented to pose for the drawings. The Bacchanal Freeze was completed in 1924, and here I show you just a couple of panels from that frieze, but it's a very long, multi-paneled version of Pavlova dancing with Mordkin in the Bacchanal itself. So yet another key player in early 20th century dance, which has had an impact on the museum's collection. Oh, and here's another shot of it from a slightly different angle. I think that is the end of my slideshow. It's a lot of slides, I know, but I wanted to cover both Carl Van Vechten and Arnold Genthe in some depth. And my original thought was to start with Genthe and then go to Carl Van Vechten, but I thought it made more sense, given that we've got the Carl Van Vechten exhibition up right now, to begin with him, to look at how he approached the dancer, and then to go kind of back in time to see the kind of images that Van Vechten may have been very well aware of. He, being interested in dance, I cannot imagine a situation where Carl Van Vechten was unaware of Arnold Genthe's photography. He was well established. Certainly his photographs of Chinatown, of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, of notable politicians and figures of society and in the entertainment world, those and being extremely prolific. I can't imagine that Carl Van Vechten did not know of Arnold Genthe's photography. And yet Carl Van Vechten's photographs of dancers are distinctly different from what came before. And he approaches the dancer in a completely different way, I think, than Arnold Genthe did. And they represent really two different moments in the history of dance in the first half of the 20th century. And from photographs by both artists, we are able to really get a good sense of who were the key players in early 20th century dance, and some of their dance movements, and sort of the infinite sort of variety, I think, that comprised the really transformative moment in really international dance and in these early years of the 20th century. So at this point, I will stop and ask if there are any questions. I'll be happy to answer those questions to the extent that I can. Well, hearing no questions, and I did go kind of long, I don't want to keep you. I only encourage you to join us again in early May for the 2 first Sundays in May, when Kate Kunow, our curator here, will look at Carl Van Vechten's photographs of visual artists and then explore the work that those visual artists were doing that helped to shape early 20th century American, primarily American painting. So join us for that. And she's going to break it up into 2 parts and look at some of the artists of the first Sunday and the works that they created and why they were such an important part of 20th century art. And then follow up the following Sunday with the other half of the visual artists that are on view in our current exhibition. So thank you all for joining me. Hope you have a good rest of your weekend, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.